Okay, depending on when you're watching this, this is, I hope, a good interview and also a good review of what we've done with what we have done or will do with confidence intervals for one sample. All of our confidence intervals, actually, whether or not they're one or two samples, will all be of the general form statistic plus or minus a confidence coefficient, which you'll see will either be a z or a t in a moment, times the standard error. So for the sample mean, we actually have two formulas. The first one, the one that actually isn't used that often, but it's a good place to start, is the sample mean plus or minus a z value times the population standard deviation divided by n. In fact, you'll know that this is the formula to use if you are given a population standard deviation. So population standard deviation and z. By contrast, you might have x bar plus or minus t times s divided by the square root of n. So s just means you have sample standard deviation. And if you have sample standard deviation, you'll have to use the t table and correct for degrees of freedom. Actually, on the top one, I should say you can use the z table, or just don't correct for degrees of freedom on the t table. Go to the bottom row, because as t approaches infinity, they become equal. So the bottom row of the t table does contain the z values by x bar plus or minus t times s divided by the square root of n, talking about where you correct for degrees of freedom. Our tables, you can do that up to 100. Your calculator will do it to whatever sample size you might consider. For proportions, it's going to be the sample statistic p hat plus or minus a z times the standard error, which is the square root of p hat, q hat over n. So those are the three basic formulas we'll use for confidence intervals. And although there'll be one little hitch to one of these, actually this one, that we'll add next week, for the confidence interval formulas for exam 2, those are the three that you'll need. I will, before I stop this video, make a couple of points here, and that is, if you see multiple choice questions and they ask you for margin of error, they're talking about everything on the right-hand side here, no matter which one it is. Those are margin of error, confidence coefficient times standard error. Of course, be careful on these. If they ask you for standard error, don't use the z or t. It's just, in the first case, sigma divided by the square root of n, or s divided by the square root of n, or the square root of p hat q hat over n, depending on whether or not you have a quantitative or a categorical variable. Remember, these are a single quantitative variable, and this will be when you have a categorical variable. It's actually a binomial categorical variable, but that's what you have there. And the other thing that you might get asked is for the interval width, and that would be to go ahead and carry out all this math here, and you'll have two numbers, a lower limit and upper limit, and of course the width will be just the difference between those two. This is actually a little bit further than an introduction to go ahead and of confidence intervals, to go ahead and hopefully prepare you for some of the especially multiple choice questions that ask about margin of error, standard error, and interval width.